Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Dr Jon Anderson. I'm going to flick onto there we are. And as we're congregated here in Hay-on-Wye, in this place right in the heart of this cultural and literary event, what better opportunity perhaps to explore the relations between fictions and cultural geographies, texts and territories, pages and places. So thank you for coming, and thank you for considering that exploring these ideas with me is a worthwhile thing to do this afternoon. So at first glance, it might seem odd for a human geographer, indeed a cultural geographer, to be interested in literature. In the popular imagination, human geography is about perhaps capital cities, it's about the lengths of rivers, about rivers in places, it's about deserts, it's about populations. It's the blue cheese segment on those Christmas games of Trivial Pursuit we play with our family. It's the Central African Republic answer on afternoon editions of Pointless, if you want to add £250 to the prize pot. But to me, the disciplines of geography and literature create a fascinating and significant dialogue, perhaps even more fascinating, significant dialogue than that between Richard and Zander on afternoons editions of Pointless. And that conversation is what I'd like to enter into this afternoon. So as a geographer, I've always been interested in the relationship between people and places. How people, to some extent, become defined by the places around us. How we are spatial beings at the same time as being social beings. How places become inveigled and intertwine with our identity into our memory and our lives. These interests, it seems to me, are not exclusive to humans working in the field of geography. Many of us perhaps exhibit a secret or not so secret interest in how geography is fundamental to our lives, and perhaps novelists are no exception to this. Indeed, for novelists in particular, the fundamental relations between people and place are crucial to harness to create an involving and page-turning fiction. Novelists can help us map our worlds in new and interesting ways. So as a human geographer, I would echo Watson's plea to use literature as a primary source material. Why? Because in the same way that geography is inherently connected to our own lives, geography is also inherently connected to fiction. So as all authors are aware, fictional worlds are constituted by three key components: characters, timeline, and geographical context. And of these three key constituents, perhaps geography is crucial. It's impossible perhaps to think of literature without any spatial context. Geography, therefore, I would argue, is essential to fiction, and it's essential in a number of ways. Think about what Rendell is speaking about here. How are we to make sense of ourselves and the world that holds us, if not by using stories? For isn't this how we've talked to ourselves, soothed, stimulated and improved ourselves for thousands of years? So literature could be important to a geographer, as maps would be to an explorer. Perhaps our philosophical treatise would be to a scholar. Perhaps even a holy book might be to a devout devotee. We can use literature to help us navigate and understand our world. And this is something that Robert Talley identifies explicitly. He says, literature can function as a form of mapping, offering its readers descriptions of places, situating them in a kind of imaginary space, providing points of reference by which they can orientate themselves and understand the world in which they live. So fiction can offer a figurative representation of the space in which we find ourselves, providing points of reference from which we can both imagine and navigate our world. Literature can become a map in itself. So this recognition is important because it makes it possible for us to identify the different roles for fiction in helping us to understand the broader relationships between people and place. We could, and geographers in the past have, positioned literature as a mirror of the world, neutrally reflecting the ontological truths discernible in real-life situations. It's as if literature, we can hold it up and completely faithfully see a truth that's out there. We could position the relationships between literature and geography slightly differently. Perhaps literature, instead of being a neutral mirror, might be a lens, a set of glasses we put on, and through which we can understand the world particularly. In that sense, therefore, literature is not a neutral, transparent lens with which we see the world. It's almost like a set of 3D glasses or sunglasses we might put on, and we see the world differently when we look through them. We foreground particular entities and processes and sets of relationships, and we background other ones. Therefore, the world that we're seeing is a socially or culturally constructed world, rather than necessarily a straightforward neutral articulation of it. But what's perhaps notable in both those different ways in which we might frame the relationships between geography and fiction is the general tendency to keep each component apart from one another, the imagined on one hand and the real on the other. We're creating an impassable boundary, perhaps, in this scholarly tradition that separates the real from imagined. We have real places and territories, and on the other hand we have imagined pages and texts. I argue, however, that this straightforward border between the modern categories of the real and imagined that define the conventional approach to literary geography is far from being impregnable in nature. In many ways there are close and fusing, indeed confusing and exciting connections between the real and the fictional. So whilst it may be tempting to keep apart the literary and the literal, this talk suggests that we fail to recognise the power of fiction if we erect this modern border between the worlds of fiction and reality. For a new literary geography, it might be more appropriate to acknowledge the existence of a permeable membrane, as Piatti et al. Have argued, between the worlds of the imagined and the real that can be crossed at will. So if we activate these previously passive relations between literature and geography in this way, we become sensitive to the agency and influence that literature has on geography, and vice versa. We can no longer maintain a rigid separation between the literary and the literal, but rather need to examine how the permeable membrane between them is crossed and contaminated. And we can do this in a number of ways, and I'm sure you're thinking of your favourite books, and perhaps I'll ask you about your favourite books later on, about how they do that for you and how the reader, the performed reading experience, takes us into particular worlds that cross and contaminate the exclusive categories, apparently, between the literary and the literal, the real or the imagined.